So today, for the first time, I am going to be trying the oldest whiskey I've ever had by a decade. That's right, I'm going to be trying a 40-year-old whiskey. This thing is as old as this is as old as me. I'm 40. Hey guys, I'm Nath Martyn, the Whisky Scribe. I'm a whiskey enthusiast and I love all things whiskey. But taste is subjective and there's a lot of different whiskies out there. So whether you consider yourself a connoisseur or you're just looking to understand more about whiskey, let's explore it all together. If you want to see more from me, consider subscribing. I put up new videos every week. You can also follow me over on Instagram. And if you do enjoy this video, please give it a like. It really does help me out and doesn't cost you a dream. Firstly, I have to say a big thank you to Uncle Baldrick. Not long ago, I did a tasting of a 30-year-old New Zealand whiskey, and I commented that it was a really good way for me to end my 30s. So then Uncle Baldrick, which is a nickname for privacy reasons obviously, reached out and said he'd really love to send me a sample of 40-year-old whiskey so that I could try that for my 40th birthday. Now, I did already do a tasting for my 40th birthday because it came up before the whiskey arrived, but you know what, 40 is a big year. I think you can extend out a 40th birthday with a couple of special drams. This is from Signatory Vintage, which is an independent bottler. It's a Craigduff 1973 40-year-old whiskey. Today I'm using a 1920 blender's glass. This is what a lot of distilleries and blenders used before we had Glencairn glasses. As far as the Glencairn goes, it's probably the best on average of everything in the fact that it's a much easier glass to hold, to clean, to carry around. And it's still, you know, it balloons out at the base and then brings all the aromas up to the nose. The 1920s blender's glass, it's a pain in the ass to clean, but it just does a little bit of a better job. You can see how wide the bowl is and how narrow the nose is. It just does a better job of bringing those aromas up to the nose. So with something this special and this rare, I didn't want to miss a single aspect of it. So this was distilled and barreled in 1973, and there's a bit of contention over where this was actually made. Some say that it was made in the Strathisla distillery, but Signatory Vintage, who held onto the barrel all these years and eventually bottled it, they claim it came from Glenkeith Distillery. Now, if you haven't heard of Glenkeith Distillery, that's because it doesn't have the 200-year history that a lot of Scottish whisky distilleries has. It was opened in 1958 in Speyside, and it was primarily used for blends like Chivas Regal, Passport, and 100 Pipers. But the Chivas brothers also used this distillery for a bit of like an experimentation ground, which is why I'm inclined to believe Signatory Vintage when they say that that's where this was made, because this was an experimental whiskey. So they did an experiment in making a double peated whiskey, and that's where the malted barley is peated, but then they've also used peated water in the actual making of the whiskey, so that you're getting that peat flavor coming in from two different aspects. And then because this was such a unique way of making whiskey, they specifically called the whiskey they made in this way Craigduff. And that's where we have the Craigduff 1973 40-year-old whiskey. Now, it spent that entire 40 years in refill sherry butts. It hasn't changed cask at any point, and it came from one barrel. So there are only 616 bottles of this ever released, and it's at cask strength at 49.6% ABV. Now, normally when you hear cask strength, you're expecting something that's somewhere between 50 and 60%. Keep in mind that in Scotland, as whiskey ages in the barrel, the ABV tends to lower because it loses a lot more of the alcohol compared to the water. And so at 40 years of age, it's dipped down below 50% ABV. But I'm not going to judge it on that. I'm going to judge it on taste alone. So as you can see, it's got a sort of a pale gold. It's almost like it kind of looks a little bit more like a Chardonnay to me, just in how gold that is. But it's a nice, thick, viscous whiskey. Plenty of very slow running legs in there, which always gives me hope. When it comes to whiskey, I'm a legs man. But on the nose, So the first thing I'm getting is this sort of peppery ash sort of wood smoke. It's definitely not your Islay style peat. It's yeah, it's more like your Highland peat, and it's got that peppery note to it. I'm trying to get past that smoke to work out what the other flavors are in there, because there's something fruity in the background. So I'm getting vanilla. I think I'm getting a little bit of sort of melons, like maybe almost even honeydew. And there's even a bit of sort of like a marzipan sort of sweetness. Frankly, the sort of spicy, fruity sort of notes in there, it almost doesn't even smell like a whiskey. Like if you had one of those, like, you know, old people love to have those scent things in their drawers so that their drawers don't smell too musty. It almost smells like one of those, but 100 times better. I have to say though, I'm glad I'm using the 1920s blender's glass, because those fruit notes in the background, I think if I didn't have something concentrating them as much, I wouldn't be getting much past that woody smoke sort of note. First time trying a 40-year-old whiskey, Slange. Jess just whispered, what if you don't like it? I do like it. There's a lot here. I'm just trying to unpack it because it's such a fear when like there's a whiskey that you've been building up in your mind. Like I've had this waiting for the right chance to try it for a couple of months now. And yeah, the longer you go without opening it, the more you build it up that you're going to be so much more disappointed if you don't like it, which is why if you've got a whiskey on your shelf, just open it up and try it. So the peat in this is unlike anything I've had before. It definitely leans more towards that Highland style peppery sort of peat, but there's this spiciness that's kind of infused with it. And if anything, it makes it taste more woody, like a dry wood too. Like sometimes when you have whiskey and it has these woody sort of notes, it's almost like this damp wood that's soaked up wine. Whereas this is like a dry wood with like an ashy peat sort of smoke, but there's something else to it that's a little bit different to what you'll normally expect. And I don't know if that's because I've just never had a 40-year-old peated whiskey, or if it's because of the unique way in which they made it. But there's other notes in there as well. I'm just trying to get past that smoke to get to them. So those melon, like that honeydew sort of flavor has come through as well. But it's almost like, I don't know if anyone has ever done this to a melon before, but it's like you've cooked it on like a char grill. It's like char grilled honeydew, if that makes any sense to anyone. There's a little bit of plum. I'm getting traces of nutmeg. I think clove is like the sort of spiciness that's sitting there at the back of the finish. I have to say this is incredibly complex, because each time I'm tasting it, I'm getting different notes. Which, if you're gonna drink a 40-year-old whiskey, you'd want it to be that complex. Like a one-dimensional 40-year-old whiskey would be pretty. Just think of all the whiskey you could have made in that 40 years, but. It's interesting that this has been aged in refill sherry barrels, because there's not a heap of sweetness. It's there, and it's only now after the third or fourth sip that I'm actually starting to get some sweet notes that I would call like a typical sherry cask whiskey. But that finish does actually, it lingers quite a while, and there's this, I know it's less than 50% ABV, but there's this beautiful burn in my chest that's sitting there, and it's not a harsh burn. It's kind of like something that warms the cockles of your heart. I think this would be a sensational whiskey to enjoy in a cold Scottish winter. That's just beautiful. I'm even starting to get like a little bit of like a waxy honey note that's lingering now on the palate as well. I am not disappointed with my first time trying a 40-year-old whiskey. So I've got to say, thank you again, Uncle Baldrick. This was something else. I've mentioned before when it comes to high age statements that, you know, not to be too impressed with them, it doesn't automatically mean that it's going to be a good whiskey. this is. But not every single whiskey that's been aged for 40 years is going to turn out good. It could easily end up being incredibly bland. It could very easily just be over oaked, where it just has too much of that woody note and it tastes like you're chewing on the staves of the barrel. And that's why when it comes to like a really high age statement whiskey, I do think you should stick to the independent bottlers like Signatory Vintage. And that's because they don't make any whiskey themselves. They buy barrels from other distilleries, they age it themselves, and they sell it when it's just right. And if they've ever aged a whiskey to the point that it doesn't taste good anymore, they're not going to release it under their name because it would damage their reputation. Because they don't make whiskey, their reputation hangs on every single whiskey they release. So they would sooner sell a bad whiskey to a blender to do whatever they want to do with it before they would actually release a really, really crappy old whiskey. And this is a prime example of that. Like, I can't speak highly enough of that. If there's any of this Signatory Vintage Craigduff 1973 40-year-old whiskey still available out there, you won't be disappointed if you buy it. It's a journey in a glass. Every single time you come back to it, it's a slightly different whiskey. And it's beautiful every time. But what about you? What is the oldest whiskey you've ever had? Please let me know in the comments below, especially if you've had something older than a 40-year-old whiskey. I'd love to see how it turned out. Even if it turned out bad, if you went out there and you got some special edition 30 or 40-year-old whiskey and it was just disappointing, I'd love to hear about that. But if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. It really does help me out and it doesn't cost you a dram. If you want to see more from me, consider subscribing. I put up new videos every week. But enjoy what's in your glass. I'm really enjoying what's in this glass. And Slange. Let's get a 45-year-old whiskey when I turn 45.